After messing with the $100 gaming PC more by turning it into a NAS, I was curious, how far can I take this thing without making it a fire hazard like my jank station? Well, I got a new Xeon, an E3 1246 V3, and a GTX 1650. So let's see how far we can push this poor Optiplex before the power supply pops. Also, a lot of people complained about my RAM, so I spent $13 to get another stick of DDR3 that will probably die. Starting out, the parts. I decided to go with a Xeon 1246 V3 because I just want to be special, and it was only $30, plus my E3 1275 V3 got destroyed during shipping, and this is what I was able to get with short notice. Still, 4 cores, although no hyper-threading still, but it has a nice solid clock speed of 3.5 GHz and a turbo speed of 3.9 GHz. You could get a higher end Xeon like the 1275 V3 I mentioned earlier, or an i7 like the 4770K or 4790K. You also could overclock those i7s a decent amount if you had a motherboard that supported overclocking, but at that point you might as well just get a newer motherboard and rebuild the whole system. Due to that, it's going to be difficult to really push the system too much further CPU-wise, as the highest end LGA 1150 CPU you can get, as far as I'm aware, is the 4790K, which is for sure getting a little long in the tooth nowadays. And also they're selling for like $100, which to me just feels like a scam. Although I will say a 4790K was my main CPU about 2 years ago, so hey, maybe it is good enough for you. Also, of course, I picked up a matching stick of HyperX DDR3 1600 MHz RAM so we can finally have 16 gigabytes of proper dual channel memory. If you were using RAM intensive programs like After Effects, I would go ahead and throw in another 16 gigabytes to get a full 32 gigs of RAM and just get a lesser GPU, since RAM will probably be a lot more limiting than the GPU. In terms of the graphics card, we don't have very many options, frankly. This power supply is only rated for about 240 watts and doesn't have any actual PCIe power connectors. I could use the SATA to PCIe power adapters from the jank station, but the internet has informed me that I was in fact correct for once in my life, and it is a fire hazard. So hey, I mean, at least I was right for once, right? Due to that, I've decided to go with a GTX 1650. It's like the GTX 1050, but now it can drive. It was only $120, and the one I received in the mail actually did have a PCIe power connector. So I guess it's fire hazard time. If you want to use a GTX 1650 for your build with a PCIe power connector, you're going to need some SATA to PCIe cables. Since this card is so low wattage though, I'm not as worried about the fire hazard aspect. Plus, if you run them off 2 separate power rails, the max power these cables can actually supply is just over 100 watts or so. And since 75 watts is coming from the motherboard and this card only takes about 120 watts, I think we will be okay. Although this does mean we'll be limited on the amount of drives we can put in here to just 2 unless you got some PCIe storage. So we're gonna have to take out those Seagate drives we just put in there. Although, on the bright side, if you are planning on going the jank station route with this build, there are a lot of other options than we initially had. If you want, you can go up to an RTX 3050 if you want, as the power consumption is just above 100 watts, or even a 1660 Super to stay in the realm of this PC, and also since there's a very good chance the RTX 3050 will bottleneck the CPU anyways, so that might not be the best way to spend your money. Also, I am still working on the $500 gaming laptop video. I just gotta wade through mountains of broken laptops and gamer grease to find the right laptop. But if you're still interested in that, make sure to subscribe because it is still coming, I promise. Putting it all together is just as simple as the first iteration of this build. Just install your GPU into the top PCIe slot, making sure you take out all of these little metal covers, then take your SATA to PCIe power connector and connect it to 2 different SATA lines for extra safety, and then plug it right into your GPU. In terms of RAM, since we have 2 8GB sticks now, what we'll have to do is we'll have to put one into the second RAM slot closest to the CPU, and then one in the slot furthest away from the CPU so we can get dual channel going. And since we have a GPU that can actually run games now, dual channel memory might actually do something. Make sure to plug your monitor into the GPU, not the onboard display ports, as that wouldn't actually use your fancy new fire hazard. These Dells also come with a kind of strange heatsink, so I want to kind of run through that real quick. It's really similar to Intel stock heatsink, but has screws instead of little clips. Unscrew it, pop it off, and then go to your CPU like usual, lift up the retention arm, take out the old CPU if you have one, line up your new CPU with the triangles, drop it in, well, okay, not drop. Once your CPU is in place, lower that retention arm back down and put a little dab of thermal paste on there. Then put the heatsink back on, trying to distribute the pressure evenly as you screw it in each corner. And once you have a boot drive, you are all good to go already. I really just love upgrading these old pre-built gaming PCs because there's just hardly any cable management or anything. You just throw some parts in and it's just ready to go. It may not be the prettiest thing, but it'll do, and it's great value. Now with those upgrades, the system comes out to about $225. If you're anything like me and your SSD or RAM dies at all, like mine did, we're gonna have to bump up the price a little bit. We'll call it an even $250. This is also assuming you sell your prior parts and break even, or if you just have a bare bones Dell Optiplex with no CPU, RAM, graphics card in regular use. Can you tell it was upgraded? Well, no. It's as simple as that. The PC was fine before. I mean, it worked, but it did start up first try and isn't giving me any issues with any of these used parts. So the Xeon and the GTX 1650 worked fine, and the SATA to PCIe power connector worked fine. No fires yet, hopefully. So starting out with some synthetic testing, we got Cinebench R23. The original $100 gaming PC got a score just above 2400. The new Xeon got a solid 3338, which is honestly a really solid bump in performance, especially since we still have a little bit more to go if we want to upgrade the CPU more to a 4790K. After that, I tried Blender BMW, which finished in 1 minute and 20 seconds using both the CPU and GPU. In terms of productivity, Lightroom unsurprisingly ran great, and surprisingly, so did Premiere. Premiere specifically took a really long time to launch for whatever reason, but even in a native 4K timeline with minor color grading, it was able to play at full speed and full resolution. I mean, it is a pretty simple timeline, but if you're doing more serious work, go ahead and check out the $500 workstation JankStation build, because it will have 14 cores, is double the price, and is so much better in Premiere. It could easily play back at full res and even was able to handle grading without major issues. Scrubbing through the timeline was a little slow though, and I personally would enable proxies to actually get smooth scrubbing. I just can't stand rough scrubbing, you know? It's like sand. With proxies, you are able to get an amazingly responsive timeline. And I honestly would have never guessed that this was a $250 PC if I just randomly saw it on the street and loaded up Premiere to edit a video in the middle of winter, whatever people do with PCs they find on the side of the street. It was also able to render out the full 5D classic review in 4K in just a minute or so over 20 minutes. That is significantly slower than the 5 minutes it took the JankStation, but it is half the price. And honestly, it might have been a little bit quicker if I was exporting to a separate SSD. Now, the fun part, gaming. Starting off with something simple. BioShock Infinite. Before, the poor GTX 650 and lower end Xeon could run the game alright, medium settings 1080p. Now we can run BioShock Infinite at 1080p ultra settings over 120 FPS consistently in the intro area. So we are just starting off really damn strong with this build. And next, CSGO, high settings 1080p, was able to manage a consistent 150 to 200 FPS. Although all those frames didn't make me better at the game though, because I am truly terrible at CSGO. BeamNG was able to run at high settings, 50 to 60 FPS, which is pretty solid overall. I didn't experience much stuttering either, which is nice. And Fallout 4, if you remember, on lowest settings, we had a basically unplayable experience, but now we can run ultra settings with a solid and consistent 60 FPS with no major drops in frame rate. And as for newer games, Doom Eternal actually ran on high settings with resolution scaling off. It got a solid 70 to 90 FPS with Vulkan. This footage was actually recorded with the resolution scaling on, and I didn't realize it somehow, which is actually pretty cool. So lastly, we have Metro Exodus, which, like Fallout 4, Metro Exodus was not able to run even on the lowest settings with the original $100 gaming PC and be even just somewhat playable. With the upgrades though, we can now run it high settings in the intro area, 50 to 60 FPS, which in later areas you might want to bump it down to maybe medium or something in my experience. And I had a few comments telling me my save corruptions had something to do with the $100 gaming PC being unstable or something like that. And I can assure you they are not. The saves corrupt across multiple computers and corrupted again during the filming of this video, which is why I'm even further back in the intro area than I was last time I tested it. I do not know why Exodus hates me so much, but it just does, unfortunately. I am really impressed though by how much more we get out of this PC with these upgrades than the original PC for just $150 extra. Yeah, it is double the price, but it's still $250. Most games ran extremely well and were actually not even bottlenecked by the CPU, surprisingly. I think, honestly, this PC has some more performance on the table if you wanted to throw a slightly higher end or newer GPU with a similar power draw along with a slightly higher end Xeon. So let me know if you want to see just how far we can push this poor LGA 1150 Optiplex with the tiny 200 something power supply. I also wanted to add two things. This PC had no issues cooling itself, even though it just had some tiny little fans on it. And a note on the SATA adapters. I actually do not suggest doing this yourself, but in my case, the wires didn't even get slightly warm after leaving games running with the GPU maxed out for extended periods of time. So honestly, if I had a tight budget, I don't think this would faze me, but build at your own risk. Honestly, I think this build is way cooler than the original $100 gaming PC. It's way more usable and can actually play most games unlike the original PC. I would have for sure preferred a GTX 1650 without the additional PCIe power. At the end of the day, it works, and I have a lot more trust in this system than the Jinx Station. Plus, if you need a PC to get started making videos, as it seems everyone does, you can easily edit 1080p video on this thing and export it in a pretty reasonable amount of time. And frankly, for 1080p, the biggest bottleneck is actually going to be the storage more than anything, especially if you can't afford solid state storage. So yeah, I think I was wrong. You can get a lot of mileage out of this little Dell Optiplex if you just want to put some time, money, and maybe set safety on the side for a little bit.